The fluorescent lights of the Crawford and Associates law firm hummed their monotonous symphony at 3 a.m, casting harsh shadows across the marble floors that Lucia Alvarez pushed her mop across with mechanical precision. Her fingers, raw and reddened from industrial cleaning solutions, gripped the wooden handle as she navigated around the mahogany conference table where, just hours earlier, attorneys in $1,000 suits had debated cases that would never touch lives like hers. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wore a name tag that read, "Maintenance Staff," while surrounded by walls lined with leather-bound legal tomes, their gilt-lettered spines promising justice, equity, fairness. Words that felt like cruel jokes when you were sleeping in your car, when your Harvard Law acceptance letter was hidden in a plastic bag under the passenger seat because you had nowhere else to keep your dreams safe from the rain that leaked through your broken sunroof. Lucia had learned to move like a ghost through these hallways, invisible to the partners who occasionally worked late, their eyes sliding past her as if she were merely another piece of furniture. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was armor. It protected her from the questions she couldn't answer, from the pity she couldn't stomach, from the assumptions that would reduce her to nothing more than her circumstances. But tonight, as she emptied the trash bin in the corner office belonging to senior partner Richard Hastings, she made the mistake of glancing at the documents scattered across his desk. Legal briefs. Case files. The intricate dance of argumentation that had once been her passion, back when she'd been a different person, back before her mother's cancer diagnosis had drained every cent they'd saved, back before the medical bills had swallowed their apartment, their security, their future whole. Her hand trembled as she reached out, not to touch, but to hover over the pages, her eyes devouring the words with a hunger that made her chest ache. She'd been accepted to Harvard Law 3 years ago. 3 years. The acceptance letter had arrived on the same day she'd found her mother unconscious on the bathroom floor, the beginning of the end, the moment when every carefully constructed plan had crumbled like sand through desperate fingers. She deferred for a year, then another, then quietly let the dream die because dreams were luxuries and her mother needed medication, needed treatment, needed someone to hold her hand through the last terrible months when the pain became everything and nothing else mattered except keeping her comfortable, keeping her alive just one more day, just one more week, just please God let her see Christmas. "You're still here." The voice came from behind her, low and sharp, cutting through her reverie like a blade through silk. Lucia spun around, her heart launching itself against her ribs, the mop handle clattering against the desk. Richard Hastings stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the walls. He was legendary in the Boston legal community, a man who'd built his reputation on impossible cases and ruthless efficiency, whose closing arguments were studied by law students, whose presence in a courtroom could shift the entire atmosphere from hopeful to desperate depending on which side you represented. He looked exhausted, she noticed, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much weight for too long. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hastings," Lucia stammered, stepping back from his desk, her face burning with humiliation. "I was just cleaning. I didn't touch anything, I swear, I was just..." She hated how small her voice sounded, how automatically she shifted into apologetic mode, as if existing in this space was itself a transgression requiring penance. "You were reading the Brennan case file," he said, moving into the office with measured steps, his gaze never leaving her face. It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation, which somehow made it worse. The argument about precedent interpretation in paragraph 4. "You lingered there for nearly 30 seconds. He settled into his chair, leaning back with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Tell me what you think about the opposing counsel's strategy." Lucia's mind went blank, then flooded with panic. This was a test, or a trap, or perhaps both. Men like Richard Hastings didn't ask janitors for legal opinions. They didn't even register janitors as people capable of having opinions worth hearing. "I should finish cleaning," she said, reaching for her mop, but his hand shot out, not touching her, just hovering in a gesture that commanded stillness. "Humor me," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite request and wasn't quite demand, but rather an offering of something she couldn't name. "You were clearly engaged with the material. I want to know why." The words came before she could stop them, tumbling out with all the pent-up frustration of 3 years spent silent. They're relying too heavily on Marshall versus Commonwealth without addressing the subsequent modifications in the appellate ruling from 2019. The precedent they're citing was effectively neutered by the higher court's interpretation, but they're presenting it as if it still holds full weight. It's intellectually dishonest, or they're hoping your team won't catch the distinction, which seems unlikely given your reputation. She stopped abruptly, horrified at herself, at the way her undergraduate degree in political science and her nearly completed first year of law school at State College before everything fell apart had just spilled out in front of this man who could have her fired with a single phone call. Richard Hastings was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You have legal training," he said finally, "and it wasn't a question." "Had," Lucia corrected, lifting her chin with whatever dignity she could muster while wearing a janitor's uniform that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. Past tense. "It doesn't matter now." "Everything matters," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on his desk, his posture shifting from casual to focused with predatory precision. "What's your name? Your real name, not whatever's on that badge." "Lucia Rodriguez." "Lucia Rodriguez," he repeated, as if testing the syllables, committing them to memory. "And where did you study law, Lucia Rodriguez?" She shouldn't answer. She should grab her mop and leave this office and never make eye contact with any attorney in this building again. But there was something in his gaze that demanded honesty, that seemed to see through whatever walls she'd built around herself. "1 year at Suffolk before I had to drop out. I was accepted to Harvard Law School. Twice I deferred. The 3rd year they rescinded the acceptance." The words tasted like ash, like failure, like every sacrifice that had led her to this moment where she was confessing her losses to a stranger who probably couldn't fathom what it meant to choose between education and survival. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or calculation. "Why did you defer?" "My mother," Lucia said simply, and was proud that her voice didn't break. "Cancer. Terminal. She died 14 months ago. By then, I'd lost everything else too. The apartment, my savings, my chance at Harvard. But she got to die without pain, in hospice care, with me holding her hand. So I'd make the same choices again." She met his gaze squarely, daring him to offer pity, to diminish her sacrifice with platitudes about silver linings or doors opening when windows closed. Richard stood, moving around his desk with fluid grace, and Lucia fought the urge to retreat. He was tall, she noticed, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. Distinguished, they'd call it in magazines. Intimidating, she'd call it in reality. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and subtle, a scent that probably cost more than her entire month's salary. "I'm going to make you an offer," he said, his voice dropping to that low register that sent shivers down her spine despite herself. "And I want you to consider it carefully before responding." Here it comes, Lucia thought with weary resignation. The proposition that powerful men always made to powerless women, dressed up in concern or opportunity but always about taking something. "Mr. Hastings, I need an associate," he interrupted, and whatever she'd been about to say died in her throat. "Someone brilliant, hungry, willing to work harder than anyone else because they have something to prove. Someone who can spot weaknesses in opposing arguments at 3 in the morning while pushing a mop because their mind can't stop analyzing even when their body is exhausted. Someone who sacrificed everything for family and understands that the law isn't just abstract theory but life and death, hope and despair, justice and inequality made manifest in courtrooms every single day." Lucia stared at him, certain she'd misheard, that exhaustion had finally broken her mind completely. "I'm a janitor," she said, the words coming out strangled. "I don't have a law degree. I don't have anything." "You have Harvard's attention, which means you have brilliance," Richard countered, his intensity building like a gathering storm. "You have survival instincts that can't be taught in any classroom. You have intimate knowledge of how the system fails people, which makes you exactly the kind of attorney we need." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of something that might have been vulnerability if men like him allowed themselves such weakness. "Here's my offer. I will personally fund your completion of law school. Harvard, if you can regain admission, or another top program if not. In exchange, you work for this firm during breaks and summers, learning from me directly. When you pass the bar, you join Crawford and Associates as a full associate with all standard benefits and compensation. You live in the apartment attached to my penthouse, rent-free, so you can focus on studying instead of survival. All expenses covered, all debt cleared, a clean slate and an actual future instead of this half-life you're living now." The words hit Lucia like physical blows, each one landing with impossible weight. This didn't happen. People like Richard Hastings didn't rescue janitors from poverty and put them through Harvard Law School. There had to be a catch, a hidden clause, a price she couldn't see yet. "Why?" she demanded, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't know me anything. What do you really want?" Something flickered across his face, too fast to interpret, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. 10 years ago, I was a public defender drowning in student loans, living in a basement apartment with black mold and mice, working 100 hours a week on cases no one else wanted. A senior partner at a corporate firm saw me argue a case and made me a similar offer. He funded my transition, mentored me, gave me opportunities one could never have created myself. He died 5 years ago, and before he did, he made me promise something. Richard's jaw tightened. He made me promise that when I had the power, I'd pay it forward. That I'd find someone brilliant being crushed by circumstance and give them the same chance he gave me. I've been looking for 3 years. And then I walk into my office at 3 in the morning and find a janitor who can dismantle opposing counsel's argument in 30 seconds because she can't stop being a lawyer even when the world has told her she's not allowed to be one anymore. Lucia's eyes burned, tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back furiously. "There's always a price," she said, her voice shaking. "Always. What do you really want from me?" "Excellence," Richard said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. I want you to become the attorney you were meant to be. I want you to fight for clients the way you fought for your mother. I want you to walk into Harvard Law School and prove that brilliance doesn't care about bank accounts or zip codes or how many times life has knocked you down." He extended his hand. "I want you to accept this offer and change your life, Lucia Rodriguez. Because you deserve better than spending your nights invisible to people who should see you. Because talent like yours is too rare to waste. Because someone helped me once, and this is how I keep that legacy alive." She stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a live wire, crackling with possibility and danger in equal measure. Every instinct screamed caution, whispered about fairy tales that turned into nightmares, about deals that seemed too good to be true because they always were. But beneath the fear, beneath the self-protective cynicism that 3 years of struggle had carved into her bones, something else stirred. Hope. Terrible, fragile, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, this was real. That maybe the universe owed her something after taking everything else. That maybe she could reach out and grab this lifeline without it dissolving into smoke between her fingers. "I'm living in my car," she said abruptly, the confession ripping out of her. "I shower at the gym across the street. I eat 1 meal a day, whatever's cheapest at the bodega on the corner. I have $327 in my bank account and 200 of that needs to go to car insurance next week. I haven't bought new clothes in 8 months. I'm not the inspiring story you think I am. I'm just desperate and tired and so angry at the world I can barely breathe sometimes." "I know," Richard said quietly, and the gentleness in his voice nearly broke her. "I had an investigator pull your employment records after I saw you reading case files 2 weeks ago. I know you're homeless. I know you're working 2 other jobs during the day. I know you still have $18,000 in medical debt from your mother's final hospitalization. I know everything, Lucia, and I'm offering anyway. This isn't charity. This is investment. I don't save people. I recognize assets that others have overlooked, and I position them for success. You're not a charity case. You're the best decision I'll make this year." Lucia's hand moved before her brain could override the decision, her palm meeting his in a grip that felt like signing a contract in blood, binding and irrevocable. His hand was warm, dry, steady, everything hers wasn't, and when he squeezed gently, she felt something in her chest crack open, years of defensive armor splintering under the weight of this impossible kindness. "When do I start?" she whispered. "Now," Richard said, releasing her hand and moving to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "We're calling Harvard admissions tomorrow. I happen to golf with the dean. If he won't reinstate your acceptance, we'll get you into Columbia or Yale, though I prefer Harvard's program for what I need to teach you. Tonight, you're leaving that car behind and moving into the penthouse apartment. Tomorrow, we're dealing with your debt and getting you a stipend so you can quit the other jobs. Next week, we're starting your legal education in earnest, because you've got 4 months before the fall semester begins and I intend to ensure you're not just ready but exceptional." The room was spinning, or maybe Lucia was spinning, untethered from the reality she'd known for so long that this new possibility felt like freefall. "Mr. Hastings, I can't just," Richard, he interrupted, looking up from the computer screen with an expression that was almost a smile, the first crack in his professional facade. "If we're going to be working together this closely, you should probably use my first name. And yes, you can. You're going to. Because the alternative is going back to that car, back to survival mode, back to watching your potential drain away night after night in offices like this one, invisible to people who should see you but never will." He stood again, reached into his desk drawer, and pulled out a set of keys. "Penthouse is on the 42nd floor. Code is 4-2-7-6. There's a full kitchen, stocked fridge, bedroom with actual furniture, bathroom with water pressure that doesn't require prayer. Go. Sleep in a real bed. Tomorrow we begin rebuilding your life from the ground up. Lucia took the keys with shaking hands, the metal cold and solid and impossibly real against her palm. Why do I feel like I'm making a deal with the devil? She asked, trying for humor but landing somewhere closer to terror. Richard's expression sobered. Because you're smart enough to know that this changes everything. That accepting help means accepting vulnerability. That letting someone invest in you means owing them something you can't quantify. He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and his voice dropped to that whisper that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate in her bones. But here's what I need you to understand, Lucia. I'm not the devil. I'm not your savior either. I'm simply a man who recognizes brilliance when he sees it, who has the resources to help, and who believes that the legal system needs attorneys who've seen both sides of justice, who've experienced what it means when the law fails to protect people who need it most. You don't owe me gratitude. You don't owe me devotion. You owe me excellence, hard work, and the commitment to becoming everything you're capable of being. That's the only price I'm asking. Can you pay it? She thought of her mother, of those final days when pain medication couldn't quite touch the agony, when all Lucia could offer was her presence and her promise that she wouldn't let the sacrifice be for nothing. She thought of the acceptance letter, still in that plastic bag, still in the car she was apparently leaving behind tonight. She thought of every humiliation, every moment of invisibility, every time someone had looked through her instead of at her. And she thought of the courtroom she'd visited once during her time at Suffolk, watching a brilliant attorney defend an impossible case and win because she refused to accept that justice was only for people who could afford it. I can pay it, Lucia said, her voice steady now, strengthened by decision. I will pay it. And Richard? She met his gaze squarely, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, seeing past the power and the wealth to the man who'd once been drowning in student loans and black mold, who'd been given a chance and was passing it forward. Thank you. For seeing me. For this. For believing I'm worth the investment. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Richard said simply. Now go. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we have work to do. Lucia walked out of that office with the keys clutched in her hand like a talisman, her mop and bucket abandoned by the desk, her old life left behind with the industrial cleaning supplies. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another world, and when she unlocked the door to the penthouse apartment, stepping into space that was larger than anywhere she'd lived in 3 years, sinking onto a leather sofa that probably cost more than her car was worth, she finally let herself cry. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, releasing years of held breath, of clenched muscles, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. She cried for her mother, for the dreams deferred, for the girl she'd been before the world had taught her that hope was dangerous. And then, when the tears finally stopped, she walked to the bedroom, stripped off her janitor's uniform, and fell into a bed with sheets that felt like clouds, sinking into sleep that was deep and dreamless and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, safe. The next 4 months passed in a blur of intensity that left Lucia breathless and exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. Richard was demanding in ways she couldn't have anticipated, pushing her not just to remember what she'd learned years ago but to think deeper, argue harder, question everything. They worked together in his office after hours, her nominal duties as his assistant during the day providing cover for the real education happening when the rest of the firm went home. He taught her how to research case law with surgical precision, how to identify the single weak point in opposing arguments that could unravel entire cases, how to craft closing statements that appealed to both logic and emotion without sacrificing either. He was patient when she struggled, merciless when she made lazy arguments, and occasionally, in moments when she'd successfully dismantled some legal theory he'd presented for destruction, almost proud. You're thinking like a victim, he told her one evening when she'd been arguing about unfair sentencing disparities, her passion making her sloppy. Stop. You're not a victim anymore, Lucia. You're an attorney. Victims react. Attorneys strategize. Channel that anger into something surgical. Make them feel your rage through the precision of your argument, not through volume or emotion. Make them unable to dismiss you because your logic is unassailable. She'd wanted to argue, to defend her approach, but he was right and she knew it. So she'd taken a breath, restructured her argument, and presented it again with cold, calculated fury that was far more devastating than heated passion. His smile, rare and genuine, had been worth the ego bruising. There she is, he'd said softly. There's the attorney who's going to terrify opposing counsel. Harvard's dean of admissions had indeed been receptive to Richard's call, especially after hearing Lucia's story and reviewing her original application materials. The meeting had been surreal, sitting in an office with 19th-century oil paintings on the walls while a man in a bow tie explained that the school would be honored to have her as part of their incoming class, that her deferral circumstances were exactly the kind of life experience that enriched their student body, that they'd been hoping she might reapply. Lucia had signed the acceptance paperwork with hands that trembled only slightly, thinking about the first acceptance letter still tucked away in her old car, which now sat in a storage facility, a relic of a previous life she was finally, truly leaving behind. The medical debt disappeared with a single phone call from Richard's financial attorney, paid off completely with documentation that it was a firm investment in an associate's education, tax-deductible and entirely legal. Lucia had protested, insisted she'd pay it back, but Richard had simply raised an eyebrow and said, "You will. Through your work. Stop thinking about money and start thinking about how you're going to graduate top of your class." It was both dismissive and empowering, his way of reframing everything from charity to business transaction, and she found herself grateful for his refusal to let her wallow in obligation. Living above him in the penthouse had created an intimacy she hadn't anticipated. Not romantic, not exactly, but something deeper than mere professional mentorship. He learned that she couldn't function before her second cup of coffee. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, heard him pacing his apartment below at 3 in the morning. He discovered her habit of reading case files while eating cereal directly from the box. She noticed that he never mentioned family, never took personal calls, seemed to exist entirely for his work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. They established rhythms, unspoken rules. Coffee together in the morning before the firm came alive, discussing cases over takeout Chinese food at midnight, respecting each other's space while somehow always being aware of each other's presence. It was Richard who drove her to Cambridge on move-in day, his sleek black car cutting through traffic with the same efficiency he brought to everything. They didn't talk much during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts, but when he pulled up to the dormitory and helped her carry the new laptop he'd given her and the carefully curated professional wardrobe his assistant had helped her select, he'd paused before leaving, his hand on her shoulder, his expression serious. "You're going to feel out of place," he said. "You're going to be surrounded by people who've never wondered where their next meal was coming from, who've had every advantage, every opportunity. Don't let them make you feel less than. Your experiences make you better than, Lucia. More empathetic, more driven, more understanding of what's actually at stake when we practice law. Use it. And call me when you need to remember why you're here." She'd nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him drive away with a mixture of terror and determination churning in her gut. Then she'd turned toward the Gothic architecture of Harvard Law School, toward the ivy-covered walls and the legacy of legal minds that had shaped the American justice system, and she'd thought about the janitor's uniform still packed in a box somewhere in storage, kept as a reminder of where she'd come from, of how far she'd traveled in 4 impossible months. Harvard was everything she'd dreamed and nothing she'd expected. The coursework was brutal, the competition intense, the pressure relentless. Her classmates were brilliant, privileged, confident in ways she'd never be, moving through the world with the assurance that came from never having doubted their right to space. Lucia felt like an imposter for the first month, certain that someone would discover she didn't belong, that her acceptance was a mistake, that she was a charity case playing dress-up in a world designed for people born to different circumstances. But then she'd started speaking in class, started challenging professors, started earning the grudging respect of her peers through sheer intellectual firepower, and the imposter feeling began to fade, replaced by something fiercer. She belonged here. She'd earned this. Every night in that car, every humiliation, every sacrifice had purchased her right to this seat in this classroom, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone make her feel otherwise. She called Richard weekly, sometimes more, their conversations ranging from specific case discussions to broader philosophical debates about justice and the law's role in society. He never asked how she was doing socially, never pressed about whether she was happy, only whether she was learning, whether she was being challenged, whether she was becoming the attorney he knew she could be. It should have felt cold, transactional, but instead it felt like the deepest form of respect. He believed in her capabilities, not her feelings, and that belief was more sustaining than any amount of emotional coddling could have been. Her first-year internship was at the firm, of course, working directly under Richard during winter break. She'd expected it to be a return to familiar territory, but instead found herself seeing everything with new eyes. The cases she'd once admired from the outside were even more complex from within. Richard gave her research assignments that would have broken less prepared students, expected her to work the same inhuman hours he did, never offered praise but instead marked her work with extensive notes demanding deeper analysis, better sourcing, more creative legal thinking. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and when he finally looked up from one of her memos and said, "This is excellent work, Lucia. Partner track quality. She'd felt something in her chest expand with pride so fierce it was almost painful. The pattern repeated through her second year. Classes at Harvard, where she'd risen to the top quartile of her class and earned a position on law review. Summer internship at Crawford and Associates, where Richard had her second chairing depositions and sitting in on client meetings, learning how law was practiced rather than just theorized. She moved out of the firm's penthouse apartment that year, finding a small place in Cambridge that she could afford with her stipend and summer salary, needing to prove to herself that she could stand independent. Richard had simply nodded when she told him, understanding without her having to explain that this was about dignity, about ensuring she wasn't dependent on his continued goodwill for survival. They grew closer during those years, in the way that mentors and students did when the partnership was built on genuine mutual respect rather than obligation. Richard remained demanding, exacting, refusing to lower standards or offer special treatment. But he also became something like family, the person she called when she landed her first oral argument in moot court, when she bombed a criminal procedure exam and needed to hear that one failure wouldn't define her career, when she won the prestigious Ames moot court competition and wanted to share the victory with someone who understood what it meant. He attended her graduation, sitting in the audience with an expression that might have been pride, though he'd never quite allow himself the softness required to name it as such. The bar exam loomed like a mountain she'd been climbing toward for 3 years, and Richard was uncompromising in his preparation demands. He created practice exams more difficult than anything the actual test would include, drilled her on multi-state questions until she could recite rules in her sleep, reviewed her essays with the same merciless eye he'd bring to an appellate brief. "You don't pass the bar," he told her. "You dominate it. Because when you walk into Crawford and Associates with that license, I need everyone in the building to know you earned your place through excellence, not charity. I need them unable to question whether you belong. Understood?" She understood. And she dominated the bar exam with a score that put her in the 98th percentile, high enough that firms across Boston were calling with offers, trying to poach the brilliant new attorney everyone was talking about. But Lucia had made a promise 4 years ago, shaking hands with a man who saw her when she was invisible, and she kept her promises. She joined Crawford and Associates as a first-year associate with a salary that would have seemed impossible when she'd been sleeping in her car, an office with her name on the door, and a reputation as Richard Hastings' protégé that opened doors and created expectations in equal measure. The first year of practice was trial by fire. Richard didn't shelter her or ease her into responsibilities gradually. He threw her into the deep end with complex cases, impossible deadlines, and clients who didn't care that she was new, they only cared whether she could win. She worked 100-hour weeks, survived on coffee and adrenaline, learned how to think on her feet when depositions went sideways, how to negotiate settlements that protected clients while avoiding costly trials, how to stand in front of judges and argue with the authority of someone who belonged in that courtroom. She lost cases, too, learned the bitter taste of defeat, but Richard taught her how to analyze failures without being destroyed by them, how to extract lessons that would make her sharper next time. They maintained professional boundaries at work, never gave anyone ammunition to suggest she'd received preferential treatment or that their relationship was anything other than attorney and mentor. But in the early morning hours, when they were both in the office before anyone else arrived, or late at night when they were the last ones left, the walls came down slightly. He told her about the public defender years, about the clients he'd failed to save, about the cases that haunted him still. She told him about her mother, about the guilt that sometimes crept in wondering if she'd made the right choices, if there was some path she'd missed where both of them could have survived intact. These conversations felt like gifts, rare moments of vulnerability from two people who'd learned to armor themselves against a world that punished weakness. 5 years after Lucia had walked into Richard's office as a janitor, she stood in that same office as a junior partner, having won a case that the entire legal community had been watching, a precedent-setting decision about healthcare accessibility that would protect families like hers from the kind of financial devastation that had once destroyed her life. Richard had watched from the gallery, expressionless as always during proceedings, but afterward, in the privacy of his office, he'd poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch and raised his in a silent toast. "You've exceeded every expectation," he said quietly. "You're not my protégé anymore, Lucia. You're my peer. And more than that, you're exactly the kind of attorney the profession needs. Someone who remembers what it costs when we fail." Lucia looked at the man who'd changed her trajectory with a single impossible offer, who'd invested in her when she'd had nothing but potential and desperation, who'd pushed her harder than anyone else ever had because he knew what she was capable of becoming. "I need to tell you something," she said, her heart pounding with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. "That night, when you found me in your office, I was ready to give up. Not just on law school, on everything. I was so tired of fighting, of being invisible, of trying to convince myself that surviving was enough when I was slowly dying inside. You didn't just give me Harvard, Richard. You gave me back the belief that I deserved to exist as more than just my circumstances. That my mind, my abilities, my perspective had value. You saved my life. His expression shifted, something unguarded flickering across his face before he locked it down again, but not before she saw what might have been emotion shining in his eyes. You saved yourself, he said firmly. I just provided resources. Everything else, every achievement, every victory, every moment of brilliance, that was you, Lucia. All I did was recognize what was already there and create space for it to grow. Don't credit me with your success. You earned every bit of it. Then let me thank you for seeing me, she insisted, moving closer, needing him to understand the magnitude of what his investment had meant. For believing I was worth saving when I'd stopped believing it myself. For being the person who proved that sometimes, impossibly, life offers second chances to people like me. I will spend the rest of my career paying forward what you gave me. Finding the invisible people, the ones everyone else overlooks, and seeing them the way you saw me. Richard set down his glass, and when he looked at her, really looked at her, she saw past the brilliant attorney and the demanding mentor to the man who'd once been drowning in student loans and black mold, who'd been given a chance by someone who believed in paying it forward, who carried that promise like a sacred responsibility. Then my mentor's legacy continues, he said softly. And perhaps that's the best kind of immortality. Not in courtroom victories or landmark cases, but in the lives we change, the potential we recognize, the futures we make possible for people the world has written off. You're going to change someone's life someday, Lucia. You're going to find your janitor. And when you do, you'll understand why I never wanted your gratitude. This was never about you owing me. It was about continuing a cycle of recognition that someone started for me, that I continued for you, that you'll continue for someone else. That's the real victory. That's justice in its purest form. Lucia raised her glass, tears threatening but held at bay through sheer force of will. To impossible offers, she said, her voice thick with emotion. To mentors who demand excellence instead of gratitude. To second chances and the people brave enough to offer them. And to every janitor in every office building who's brilliant and invisible and just waiting for someone to see them. To every janitor, Richard echoed, and they drank together, two attorneys who'd walked very different paths to the same destination, bound by a debt that could never be repaid because it was never meant to be paid, only passed forward, an endless chain of recognition and investment and belief in human potential that refused to be constrained by circumstance or class or the cruel mathematics of who got opportunities and who got overlooked.